In the film Risky Business, the Tom Cruise character says of a classic sports car, Porsche, there is no substitute. Very much the same is true of the two Alice adventures written by Lewis Carroll. But just as the iconic Porsche 911, it's actually a 928 in the movie, has inspired later sports cars, so Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass have led to numerous imitations, pastiches, and works of homage. In our own time, the most successful of these is doubtless Norton Juster's The Phantom Toll Booth, which a couple of years back celebrated its 50th anniversary with a special annotated edition assembled by yesterday's speaker, Leonard Marcus. Juster's story about the boy Milo's search for the princess's rhyme and reason in a pun-filled wonderland of strange creatures somehow catches the real Carolian spirit. Early on, Milo takes a wrong turn and lands in the doldrums, where he meets the Lethargians, whose days are just packed with naps and dawdling and endless dilly-dallying. As you can see, that leaves almost no time for brooding, lagging, plotting, or procrastinating. And if we stopped to think or laugh, we'd never get nothing done. You mean you'd never get anything done, corrected Milo. We don't want to get anything done, snapped another angrily. We want to get nothing done, and we can do that without your help. As you will recall, Milo eventually escapes the doldrums and makes his way to Dictionopolis, where he causes trouble in the word market and is brought up before a judge. Now, would you like a long or a short sentence? A short one, if you please, said Milo. Good, said the judge, rapping his gavel 3 times. I always have trouble remembering the long ones. How about I am? That's the shortest sentence I know. Everyone agreed that it was a very fair sentence, and the judge continued, there will also be a small additional penalty of 6 million years in prison. Case closed. When I was asked to come speak at today's conference and was casting about for a subject, I began to wonder if any of the much earlier would-be Alices were anywhere near as good as Juster's modern homage. So I decided to read a half a dozen and report on them to you this afternoon. But which ones to choose? From various sources, including the contents page of Carolyn Sigler's Alternative Alices, and various lists supplied by Alan Tannenbaum and Edward Wakeling, I could see that there were scores of possibilities just from books published during the lifetime of Alice's creator. In fact, Carroll himself collected some of these imitations. Frederick Weatherly's Elsie's Expedition, 1874, Tom Hood's From Nowhere to the North Pole, 1875, and Edward Holland's Mabel in Rhineland, 1885, among others. Still other pastiches bore such tantalizing titles as Carl and the Queen of Queerland by Mrs. E.T. Corbett, 1880, Gladys in Grammarland by Audrey Mayhew Allen, 1890, Alice in Motorland by Horace Wyatt, 1904, and skipping ahead a few years, Howard Garris's Uncle Wiggily in Wonderland, 1921, and the rather racy-sounding Dorothy's Adventures in Bedroom Land by Mabel H. Andrews, 1923. Instead of any of these, though, I decided to pick late Victorian and Edwardian works that were well known in themselves or because they were written by relatively famous authors. Thus, I settled on Speaking Likenesses by Christina Rossetti, 1874, The Wally Pug of Y by G.E. Farrow, 1895, Blown Away by Richard Mansfield, 1897, Davy and the Goblin by Charles Carroll, 1884, Alice in Blunderland by the American humorist John Kedrick Banks, best known for A Houseboat on the Styx, in which famous characters from literature, including Sherlock Holmes, have adventures in the afterlife. The short story Just Now Land by E. Nesbit, published in 1912 in The Magic World, but written earlier, and Only Toys by F. Anstey, 1903. He's the writer who gave us the original Freaky Friday story, Vice Versa, in which a father and son switch bodies or minds. So let's begin. Unfortunately, I got off to a rough start. Rossetti's speaking likenesses consist of 3 stories, and I could only bear to read, or rather skim, the first. In this one, everything seems disappointing to Flora at her 8th birthday party until she enters a magic kingdom where the queen is incredibly rude to her. In the end, the little girl returns home better able to support trifling disappointments. It's hard to realize that this maudlin work is by the poet of the unsettling, disturbingly sexy Goblin Market, or the moving poem, Remember. Remember me when I am gone away, gone far away into the silent land, when you can no more hold me by the hand, nor I have turned to go, yet turning stay. It goes on, it's a wonderful poem. By contrast, The Wally Pug of Wye by G.E. Farrell really turned out to be a treasure, probably the best of the early Alice-inspired books. Farrell, in fact, was often likened to Carroll and didn't mind this a bit. It has frequently been said that I endeavor to make my stories resemble his, and whether this is said in praise or in blame, as it sometimes is, I'm always equally glad to hear it, for it is surely a great thing if I have caught even a faint echo of the charm of his delightful books, which have for so many years given pleasure to thousands of people, young and old. One further reason exists for Farrell's frequent comparison to Carroll. The early Wally Pug books are illustrated by Harry Furness, who did the pictures for Sylvia and Bruno. Very little is known about G.E. Farrell, which is surprising given that he published 30 books over 2 decades. After finishing The Wally Pug of Wye, I would have liked to have read some of his others, but they are hard to find and relatively expensive. Still, I may someday spring for The Wally Pug in the Moon, which is said to be his best book. Anyway, Wally Pug of Wye is his first book. It opens when the heroine, with the simpering name Girly, is restless and bored at home until she receives a letter from her brother with the enigmatic phrase, "I have found a goo." She wonders what a goo is, and suddenly her doll Dempsey Diesel starts to talk and tells her that she can find out about the goo by traveling to the land of Wye, where all the questions and answers come from. To get there, Girly only needs to hang on to Dempsey Diesel's hand, close her eyes, and count to 100. Unfortunately, Girly opens her eyes at number 86, consequently loses her helpful doll, and finds herself in the strange land of Wye all on her own. Immediately, she starts to meet some strange beings. First, there's the doctor-in-law, a flim-flam artist who charges for every word he utters. He's immediately followed by a bizarre-looking personage who resembles a kangaroo and opens his conversation by saying, "Don't you think me very handsome?" When Girly hesitantly says no, he replies, "Dear me, then your eyes must be seen to, decidedly." He turns out to be the king's minstrel and a rather decadent poet. "I make it a point never to do anything useful. I am purely ornamental." He then recites one of his poems. "Won't you walk into my parlor," said the spider to the fly. "How I wonder what you are up above the world so high." "I'm going a milking, sir," she said, and when she got there, the poor dog was dead. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Gin a body, kiss a body, need a body cry. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, and if I don't hurt her, she'll do me no harm. Girly's protests that these are all lines from other poems has no effect on the foppish poet's vanity. Next, our heroine encounters a fish wrapped in a shawl holding a rod and reel. He is currently fishing for compliments. But later that afternoon, we'll be lecturing on the whichness of what as compared to the thatness of thus. Later on, she rides on a train with all the letters of the alphabet, each of whom only uses words to start with, so to speak, its own letter. To the hungry Girly, S smilingly suggested something substantial. She said she should supply sandwiches. In the land of Wye, the animals don't only talk, but they take words quite literally. For example, a crocodile given a weak cup of tea takes it out in a perambulator, hoping that some brisk, fresh air will strengthen the poor little thing. Throughout, Farrow's tone is light and charming, and as I say, surprisingly Carolian at times. "It's no use whatever asking questions," said the husher crossly, "if you can't tell us whether we give you the correct answer or not. And how can you do that if you don't know yourself?" The Wally Pug, it turns out, is a kind of king, albeit one governed by the people instead of governing them. He wears hopelessly oversized robes, which he constantly trips over, and is altogether an endearing schmo. He reminds me of Dopey in the Disney Snow White. At the Wally Pug's fancy dinner party, Girly discovers that you don't actually get served anything. You simply fancy that you have eaten. This may not be such a bad thing, since the menu includes roast grief and minced words. When Girly meets a crow, he tells her what the crows think a goo is. Our family have come to the conclusion that it is a kind of worm, an enormously large worm, because everybody's so very anxious to find it, and a worm being the only thing in the world worth troubling about, it must be a worm. If it isn't worth looking for, that's all. As Girly continues her search for the goo, she passes a shop with the sign, "Madame Penguin, excuse maker to the Wally Pug and the royal family. Elaborate excuses prepared at the shortest notice." She stops to chat, as Girly stops to chat, notice some items in glass cases. "Those are promises, my dear," explained Madame Penguin. "And we have to keep them in glass cases because they are so very brittle. As it is, we get a great many broken ones, and then we have to sell them like this." And she fetched a tray from the window with some little packages piled on it marked "Broken Promises, 3 a penny each." Many more adventures ensue before Girly makes her way home. Once there, she looks again at her brother's letter and turns it over to find out that I have found a goo was actually "I have found a good many shells." I had great hopes for Davy and the Goblin. My copy, extremely battered, comes from the library of my late friend Alice Turner, one of the best-read people I've ever known, herself author of the scholarly The History of Hell, and in her day job, the long time, for many, many years, fiction editor of Playboy. The book begins with Davy curled up in an easy chair by the blazing fire reading about the marvelous things that happened to little Alice in Wonderland. Suddenly, a peculiar creature appears, who calmly munches on some of the hot coals in the fireplace, and then accuses Davy of being a little boy who doesn't believe in fairies, nor in giants, nor in goblins, nor in anything the storybooks tell you. By the way, this is a common theme in many of these books, children who have somehow lost their faith in fairy tales or toys or play, and need to rediscover their sense of wonder. The Goblin decides to send Davy on a believing voyage. The pair immediately zoom off on a clock that has been transformed into a kind of flying carpet. Up in the air, Davy notices that a certain window of his house has become a round hole. Why? "Oh," said the Goblin carelessly, "that's one of the circular singumstances that happen on a believing voyage." Circular singumstances is, I think, a delightful spoonerism. Throughout the chapters that follow, the Goblin regularly disappears at moments of crisis, then unexpectedly reappears when the dust has settled. In this strange world, we soon learn things very often turn out to be different from what they would have been if they hadn't been otherwise than as you expected they were going to be. Davy naturally encounters the usual panoply of unlikely creatures, such as the cockalorum and the hole keeper. This latter keeps a notebook that is perfectly blank because it contains all the names that ought to be out of it. He soon renames Davy Rupsy Frimbles. Later, that name is further altered to Frungles, and at one point, Davy is even demeaningly referred to as the Frungles thing. In a particularly charming episode, our young hero meets a very serious-looking crow. I mean, not crow. Take that back. Cow. That's what you get, cow. So crows, cows. Cow. Presently, the cow said in a melancholy, lowing tone of voice, "The old gray goose is dead." "I'm very sorry," said Davy, not knowing what else to say. "She is," said the cow positively, "and we've buried her in the vegetable garden. We thought gooseberries would come up, but they didn't. Nothing came up but feathers." "That's very curious," said Davy. "Curious but comfortable," replied the cow. "You see, it makes a feather bed in the garden. The pig sleeps there and calls it his quill pen." Davy then asks, "What else is there in the garden?" "Nothing but the beanstalk," said the cow. "You've heard of Jack and the Beanstalk, haven't you?" "Oh, yes, indeed," said Davy, beginning to be very much interested. "I should like to see the beanstalk." "You can't see the beans talk," said the cow gravely. "You might hear them talk. That is, if they had anything to say and you listened long enough." After an encounter with Mother Hubbard and a sleepy giant, Davy encounters none other than Robin Hood, who is standing in front of a butcher shop and calling out, "Steaks, chops." Davy doesn't want any meat, but quite naturally inquires, "Venison is dear, isn't it?" And, wait for it, Robin Hood replies, "Not at all. It's the cheapest meat about here." Bada-boom. "But there's more." "Oh, I didn't mean that," replied Davy. "I meant that it comes off of a deer." "Wrong again," said Robin Hood triumphantly. "It comes on a deer. I cut it off myself." You will be pleased to learn that Little Red Riding Hood is the daughter of Robin Hood. Davy later meets an Arabian Nights wizard, Robinson Crusoe, and Sinbad the Sailor, as well as a horse named Ribsy. As it happens, I was reading this book on April 12th, the very day when Beverly Cleary, who gave the world Henry Huggins' much more famous dog, Ribsy, was celebrating her 100th birthday. Well, Davy and the Goblin does possess a certain low-key charm. It's never quite memorable enough. The characters don't have distinctive personalities. The jokes are so-so. And its best part may be the illustrations by E.B. Bensell and Herman J. Bacharach. I found Blown Away by Richard Mansfield to be a better fantasy. I normally like to own books I read, but by the time I decided to include this one in my talk, it was too late to buy a copy. So I read one of those online texts from the Hathi Trust. It was, I might point out, the first time I've ever read an entire book on a screen. I don't have a Kindle anyway. Mansfield opens with a winning, if slightly labored, tongue-in-cheek introduction. The author read these pages to a number of small boys who could not escape. The smallest and least intelligent boy was amused. He bore out the promise of his childhood by becoming a publisher. He trailed the man who had corralled him on that rainy day. His object was to wreak a long-delayed vengeance by publishing this book. He accomplished his fell purpose by bribing the author. Nothing remains but to pity the author and to execrate the publisher. The author's affection for his wife is his reason for not dedicating these pages to her. Blown Away opens with a Wizard of Oz-like flourish. A cyclone rips through a house in which live 40 girls with their mother. Only our two heroines survive. The 38 sisters and the bereaved mother were never discovered, although a number of expeditions were sent out to search for them, and other expeditions had to be forwarded to find the first expedition, and so on. But let that pass. Let us follow the fortunes, which is absurd for neither of them had a penny, of Beatrice and Jessie, or vice versa. Note Mansfield's jaunty tone, a bit forced and winkingly knowing, but certainly amusing enough. Before long, Beatrice and Jessie land in an animal fairyland where they must rescue a prince who is under a sleeping spell in a boarding house. To release him from the spell, they are told, you must kiss both his eyes, his lips, and his ears, and sit down by his side and call for 2 beers. In the course of their fairy tale quest, our two heroines make many discoveries. Did you know, for example, that there are small countries that float on the surface of bathwater? And regularly they converse with various talking animals. They also find themselves listening to lots of vaguely familiar-sounding poems. One begins this way. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis the janitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only it and nothing more," goes on. As these verses suggest, there's considerable wordplay in Mansfield's book. Some of his puns are quite subtle and clever. This is my favorite. Presently the bell in the steeple struck, and it was quite a long time before I could be persuaded to go on. But here's another. "What's the capital of England?" "Money," said Beatrice. "Right," said the schoolmaster, "but you shouldn't have said so. It's silly to give it away." Throughout these pages, Mansfield is clearly having a lot of fun. His individual sentences can be wonderfully mock serious. As the captain does not concern us and will play no important part in this narrative, it will perhaps be as well to waste a few moments upon the description of a man who cannot possibly interest us. At other times, his humor is just appealingly strange. Beatrice and Jessie sat down and talked rapidly for 3 hours until the setting sun and the dead birds that lay all around them reminded them that the discussion had been lengthy. That's birds falling down. I very much enjoyed Blown Away, and I feel it comes very close second in overall quality and attractiveness to the Wally Pug of Wye. I entertain great hopes for Banks's Alice in Blunderland, An Iridescent Dream, which begins well. It was one of those dull, drab, depressing days when somehow or other it seemed as if there wasn't anything anywhere for anybody to do. It was raining outdoors so that Alice could not amuse herself in the garden or call upon her friend, little Lord Fauntleroy, up the street. At this point, the bored Alice is surprised by the dramatic reappearance of her old friends, the Mad Hatter, the March Hare, the Cheshire Cat, and the White Knight. As the March Hare says to the incredulous little girl, with what sounds like an American twang, "We're here all right. I know because we ain't anywhere else. And when you ain't anywhere else, you can make up your mind that you're here." In short order, the Hatter and company take Alice off to Blunderland, designed to be the perfect socialist society. Everything in town belongs to the people. Streetcars, gutters, pavements, theaters, electric light, cabs, manicures, dogs, cats, canary birds, hotels, barbershops, candy stores, hats, umbrellas, bakeries, cakeries, steakeries, shops. You can't think of a thing that the city don't own. No more private ownership of anything, from a toothbrush to a yacht. And the result is we are all very happy. "It sounds fine," said Alice, "though I think I should rather own my own toothbrush." Such bourgeois sentimentality, it turns out that teeth are publicly owned too, and those who possess them are required to crack nuts and occasionally chew for the less fortunate. That should be clear. This iridescent fantasy is actually a political fable, a send-up of what we might call the turn of the century's red dream. Most of the book is essentially an all too often tedious tour of Blunderland and its civic services. But my own favorite chapter is that describing the Department of Public Verse. It opens, "I think," said the Hatter, "that before we go any further, we better show Miss Alice our municipal poetry factory. The whistle will blow very shortly, and our divine afflatus dynamo will shut down. And so if she is to see that feature of our work, now is the time to do it." In this Department of Public Verse, we learn that the municipal laureate of Blunderland employs 16,743 poets who provide all the poetry that is consumed by our people. Poetry is cheaper by 8 cents a line than it used to be. And as you may have guessed from what the March Hare has just said, we give larger measure than was the custom under private ownership. Quatrains have been increased from 4 lines to 23. And the old stingy 14-line sonnet has been enlarged to 54 lines. We have also passed an ordinance requiring that poems shall say what they mean. How, you may wonder, does public verse get produced? By a carefully structured factory process, which starts in the thinking department. Alice passed into the darkness and dimly made out a half a hundred long-haired individuals sitting in comfortable Morris chairs, their forefingers pressed hard against their brows and their eyes gazing fixedly out into space. These men and women think the thoughts which our municipal poetry is designed to express, the commissioner continued. A thought once seized by any one of them is written down upon a pad and then taken into the next room where it is classified and assigned to the line cutters who turn out the first draft in the rough. Then when this is done, it is sent to the rhyming room where the lines are made to end in rhymes. And finally it goes to the polishing room where the poem is made ready for publication. Again, as I say, Alice in Blunderland, charmingly illustrated by Albert Levering, has its moments but lacks the snap and crackle of real nonsense, being actually intended for adults. There's a similar political content to E. Nesbit's Just Now Land. This short story is framed like Frances Hodgson Burnett's A Little Princess and piles on the pathos. Elsie is shut up in an attic by her cruel caretaker, Mrs. Staines. Her mother is recently dead and her beloved father away serving in India. The little girl's only permitted reading has been Fox's Book of Martyrs. But there, locked away in this bare attic, she encounters a crow. See, we needed that crow, which is miraculously able to grow to human size. Because Elsie had thought that she might pass the days of her imprisonment by taming a mouse or some other creature, this magic crow has come to enlist her in taming a creature in Just Now Land. He will take her there. How? There are only 2 doors out of this world into another, the crow tells Elsie. I'll take you through the nearest. Allow me. I find that allusion to 2 doors quite haunting, especially when the crow adds that he'll use the nearest one. Of course, Nesbit might simply be referring to sleep and death, but I like it just as 2 doors to the other world. Once Elsie reaches Just Now Land, we learn that all the upper class people have been transformed into crows because they were cruel to the workers. The workers, not much of a trade if you ask me, have been turned into pigeons. At all events, Elsie eventually releases a fierce dragon from a spell, which in turn frees the crows and pigeons from their enchantment. Everyone vows to be nicer to one another from now on. At the end, Elsie returns to the attic just in time to be rescued by her father, who has fortuitously come back from India. As I said, a slight story which doesn't really seem particularly Alice-inspired to me. Rather, it further promulgates Nesbit's Fabian views of society as seen far more vividly when the 5 children visit the future, in perhaps my favorite of her wonderful books, The Story of the Amulet. Well, as time has passed, let me hurry along to my last Elysian text, Only Toys by F. Anstey. Irene and Torquil, that's a name you'd only find in an English children's book, feel they are too grown up and sophisticated to play with their toys. After all, they're 9 and 10. But in a twinkling, who should appear but Santa Claus? Has it never occurred to you, he tells them, that toys have been created to be played with, not to be put on the shelf and taken no notice of? Oblige me by going into the nursery at once and playing with them. The children offer the expected feeble excuses about being too big for toys, so Santa reduces them to Lilliputian size. The brother and sister subsequently revisit their old nursery where their old playthings, shades of Toy Story, both talk and carry on lives of their own. But there's no pleasing Irene and Torquil, who soon find the dolls wooden in their movements and the lead soldiers stupid and all the toys completely unaware that they are actually toys. In a neat touch, Anstey has each of his playthings speak in the accent of its country of origin. For example, when visiting the countryside, the children discover that Mr. Farmer washes the faces and necks of his geese and ducks. Torquil says that on a real farm, the animals do this themselves. Not possible, said Mr. Farmer. Here they are not so clever. Then, he continued, we visit the pig houses to see if they have laid any eggs. Real pigs don't lay eggs, objected Torquil. I never said we find any, said Mr. Farmer craftily. So, you see, my pigs are real pigs. More kindly children would have allowed the toys to continue under the illusion that they were flesh and blood. But each time the good-hearted Queen Clementina proudly shows off one of her subjects, the children reveal that the painter or the acrobat or the admiral of the Navy is made of plaster and wires and clockwork. Ultimately, Clementina herself is made to realize that she is a toy. Don't tell me I'm one too. And she falls down in a swoon. At which point, a vexed Santa Claus reappears, and the second half of the book, a program of re-education, begins. At first, Santa plans to resuscitate Queen Clementina, but the damage is done. "If you please," said Clementina humbly, "we'd so much rather not play anymore. We're too stupid to do things properly, and we haven't houses and food and shops or anything like they ought to be, so it's really no use going on. We can't even pretend to one another any longer, and your clever friends will only look down on us all the more. Please, please take them away and leave us in peace." And she fell forward again and said no more. I find that speech quite heartbreaking. But Santa truly wants the two children to appreciate their old playthings and to have a kindly feeling for them instead of considering them beneath you. Drastic measures are needed, so this time he sends the kids to a land of superior toys, so lifelike that they are full of human foibles and vices. First, Irene and Torquil meet a French policeman who sounds like an understudy to Peter Sellers' Inspector Clouseau. The kids have clearly been acting strangely. "All that has to me the air suspect. However, for the present I do nothing. You may go, but remember, I keep on you the eye of a lynx. And if I attract you in the least little crime, I give no notice. I pounce." In this sophisticated society, the people, instead of being kindly and naive, like the simple toys of old, are now avaricious and mean. At a rooming house, the landlady's charges are very reasonable. Tuppence every stair you go up.
Sorry.
Okay.
Go away, person.
Tuppence every stair you go up, a penny every one you go down, 3 pence each time you sit down, 6 pence when you get up. Then there's the heat from fire, a halfpenny a minute, looking out of the window, a penny a pane for each glance. Up to the present you owe me, let me see. And here she did the sum in her head, exactly 7 and 5 pence apiece. However, having no money on them, the brother and sister try to earn some by getting jobs at a school, but the master wants to test them first. "Oblige me by multiplying ABC by DEF and dividing by GHI. Torquil can't do it and is scathingly informed, "My most backward scholar could do that simple sum in her head and on her head." Eventually, the two desperate kids are arrested for boarding the train to London without having bought tickets. There follows a trial in which all their misdemeanors are arranged before them, with testimony from a market woman, the royal footman, the landlady, and many others. The judge is nonetheless inclined to leniency until he hears the charge from the arresting officer. "I have detected them in the act of traveling without tickets." "What?" shrieked the judge, and his nose and chin actually faded to a pale pink. "No, I can't believe it. Whatever you may be, prisoners, tell me you have not sunk to that." Alas, they have, and must be duly sentenced, beginning with Irene. Being female, her sentence will therefore be comparatively light. She will merely go to school for a term of 50 years, or her natural life, whichever lasts longest. She will learn and repeat all her lessons backwards, with the book held upside down, and write her exercises on pink blotting paper with cold water. For every bad mark, she will get an extra month. For every good mark, she will get a half holiday. Such half holidays not to commence until after her sentence has expired. By that time, I trust she will have become a good, happy, and law-abiding little girl. Torquil, by contrast, is sent to the army, where he is to be in the vanguard of any mission regarded as, to use the old euphemism, a forlorn hope. Suicide mission. Fortunately, the children are saved when their public defender, a jack-in-the-box, convincingly proves that they aren't human beings at all. They are, it's quite obvious, only toys. Torquil and Irene are about to protest, but think better of it. Ultimately, Santa rescues the pair who have learned their lesson, we found out that we don't really know how to do things much better than toys. From now on, Irene and Torkel promised to spend more time with their old playthings rather than simply leaving them on the shelf. Only Toys is certainly eminently readable, combining bits of Carolian topsy-turvydom with a kind of music hall humor. It doesn't really compare with Anstey's real masterpieces, Vice Versa and The Brass Bottle, the lie about a young man who acquires an overly helpful genie. As I said at the beginning of this rambling talk, the two Alice books remain inimitable. Indeed, they are circular singumstances. Still, just as the aficionados of Sherlock Holmes revel in pastiches and fanfic, so Carolians can sometimes hunger for more Alice-like nonsense. The books described here, at least the best of them, can satisfy some of that hunger. To speak metaphorically, they may not taste like your mom's homemade apple pie, but they're better than no dessert at all. Thank you. If there are any comments or questions?
Do we have a list of those books? I'd like to read them all.
Well, I mean, you should have been taking notes.
Yes. I got that, yes. Oh, well, thank
No,
you.
if you write to me, I'd be happy to send you
she has already taken notes.
the titles. But I mean, they're I don't know, six or eight, or I forget how many there were.
Blown away.
I mean, it was a fun little project, and I don't know how many of these may be familiar to you already, but some of the books are hard to come by. Particularly the G.E. Farrow, who wrote a great many, they're awfully scarce. But again, a certain number are also available now in digital texts from Gutenberg or Hothy Trust. And you know, they aren't, you know, it's not Lewis Carroll, it's not Alice, but they have their moments. Other questions or comments? Yes.
So I love the comparison between Phantom Tollbooth, which is my second favorite book, to the Alice books. And are there any papers? Is there anything that really like looked at that in depth? Because I think there are. I mean, the puns are obvious, but
Yeah.
all the other.
Well, there is an annotated.
Yeah, I know. I have. Yeah.
And I don't know if I've actually read that, but I don't remember him going into any detail or even perhaps just alluding to it.
Michael
So-
Leonard talked about that a little bit last fall at the Alice 150 conference. That was part of his talk, was Alice and Milo, sort of side by side. But there's, it was still to talk. I mean, yeah, obviously people have book about that.
I mean, a lot of books have elements that you could see from Alice. I mean, The Wizard of Oz has certain Carol-like thing, going to a strange country, strange creatures. Even some of the books like Dorothy and the Wizard go underground. But the tone is somewhat different. And then if you read adult books, I mean, remember after the first book I read after I'd read the Alice books as a boy. Little boy was Frederick Brown's mystery, Night of the Jabberwock.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any of you have read that, where you discover this mysterious criminal society called the Vorpal Blades, and everything seems very supernatural. There's an explanation, but it's a delightful book. Has a great cover, by the way, of the Jabberwock. Or Mimsy Were the Borogoves, a famous story by Lewis Paget, and Ellery Queen's The Mad Tea Party. As we know from the exhibit upstairs, I mean, Alice has been reused, repurposed, as they say now, in many different ways for different different aims, and but it's delightful. But I wanted to state.
To repurpose Alice.
Huh?
I don't think Norton Juster was trying to.
No, not exactly. But he was capturing something of the same flavor and spirit, whether he did so consciously or not. I think he wanted to. He was interested in the wordplay, and it just so happened that once he had it jibes with the kind of thing that you find in Alice. But the books I talked about here, for the most part, they were all conscious of Alice in the background, because they were all basically from, contemporary with Dodgson or shortly after his death. I read Uncle Wiggily in Wonderland too, and that was a very great disappointment. I mean, I remember loving those when I was 6 or something, but they haven't held up. They seem very simple-minded to me. And the jokes, instead of having a Jabberwock, there's a Wobberjock or something like that. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yes?
Edmund Crispin's murder mysteries have
Oh.
some Crowley
Oh, yeah.
elements, especially.
Yeah, the Moving Toy Shop.
I love that.
Yeah, the movie, yeah, one of my favorite books.
Yes.
Moving Toy, yeah, dedicated to his friend Philip Larkin, who wrote the
Right.
poem in it. Yes, the Moving Toy Shop, one of the great sort of comic mystery novels about a toy shop that disappears in Oxford.
Michael, have you read the Gilbert Adair books that are definitely, trying to be a sequel to Alice on Purpose?
Yeah, I know there's Alice Through the Needle's Eye, and there's, I think, another one. I have a couple of his books. I actually don't have the Alice books. I have the ones he did of the Agatha Christie imitations. And I've read, he did a translation of Georges Perec's famous book, La Disparition, the famous novel in French written without using the letter E.
Yeah.
And so it was translated by Adair as A Void. But I have not read that book, I'm sorry to say.
I'm not that keen on them, though there may be people here who would disagree. I think they mostly just demonstrate how hard it is to write like Lewis Carroll.
Yeah, that's true. Inimitable, as I say. Again, well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much.